All right, so let's turn our attention in light of this funny little cartoon, excuse me, that's in your book, where the guy pulls up to the gas station and says, "Fill her up with testosterone." It very much fits into the stereotypes that a lot of people have about midlife crisis and men and getting their sports cars and all the other things that come with it. The thing to keep in mind when we're talking about just the psychology of sex itself. And this seems fitting since we're in the midst of Sex Week at CCU, is external stimuli such as sexually explicit materials, I think clearly trigger arousal. Um, so explicit materials trigger arousal. And in men, because we are fairly, it's clear, I think, in most circles that men are far more triggered by visual stimulation than women are. So, interestingly enough, that there seems to be a clear development of this fact in men and women both. And I suppose it's how much of our culture is visually saturated these days. The other aspect here is the whole idea of objectification, and increasingly that's happening for both sexes. The objectification of sexual objects. And increasingly, we end up doing that to each other, and that's the backdrop. What's interesting is that when we're talking about sexually explicit material, it triggers very different areas in the brain in men and women, and so their response. Um, their response accordingly is very different as well. Sexually coercive material, which again is showing up in more and more arenas, partly because of the internet, tends to increase the viewer's acceptance of rape and violence toward women, for example. Uh, Images of sexually attractive men and women lead people to devalue their partners, and that's the idea of objectification, and that's increasingly happening in our culture today. Our imaginations also influence sexual motivation. Whoops, I forgot how to. Imaginations, which influence our motivation. And interestingly enough, we are just being flooded with material, visual and otherwise, when it comes to sexually explicit materials. And the bar is changing about what is acceptable and what isn't. Wide awake people become sexually aroused both by memories of prior sexual activities and by fantasies. And that's the role that images or imagination plays. About 95% of men and women report sexual fantasies. Um, and But the thing to keep in mind is how they respond to these fantasies. A rampant problem for many men, particularly Christian men, is the struggle with masturbation, and that comes into play when we're talking about sexual fantasies. Fantasizing about sex does not indicate a sexual problem in itself. I will tell you that having done a radio show for men in a large metropolitan area, probably the key um, uh, show where I got the most callers was all around this particular issue. It is a bombarding issue in many men's minds, and women as well, for different reasons. And the challenge, I think, is to be clear about who's responsible for what, if you will, and responsibility comes into play. Making somebody responsible doesn't make one, or let me put it in another way. Men are responsible for their own sexuality. Women are not responsible for men's struggles. Men are. And vice versa is also true. It's less so because women tend to seek more intimacy, relational intimacy, than men do. Men are far and away more prone to the objectification of the object rather than the relational connection to the object, if you will. And that's always been a challenge. That's been a challenge for men for a long, long time. The interesting thing about it is that in a recent research that was done for men regarding sexual fantasy, regarding struggles with masturbation, regarding women and how they choose to clothe themselves, easily the thing that has had the greatest impact is porn and internet porn, and that leads to an objectification for men themselves. That does not mean that women are not immune. Women fantasize about different things, and so it may not be the visually explicit issues that come into play, but I think at the same time it has its impact, and it has wheedled its way, I think, even into relationships themselves, where we have grown accustomed to the whole idea of hooking up with no commitment, and it has led to an increasing level of objectification of each other, and because of that, then we care less about relationship and more about getting needs met, and that comes into play when we're talking about the psychology of sex itself. For more information, if you're interested, one of the books that Dr. Saxby and I use in our classes is called Sex in the I World, and the I World. And it's a fascinating look at the changes that have occurred over the course of time. For most baby boomers, which would be your parents, we've grown up in the T world, which is driven along by absolute values, absolute truth. That whole notion comes into play. And we've moved, and most of you would fall into the I world. And there are some presuppositions that come with that. I won't get into that now. The thing that we need to move toward is not a return to the T world as much as it is to a world that values relationship and people within those relationships. And I'll just say that much to highlight it for you. But it comes into play when we're talking about sexual motivation and when we're talking about sexual orientation, which is another topic we'll hit on in just a moment.